Okay, Laura Huang, welcome to the next big idea.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Laura, as an engineer turned business professor, I'm wondering, did this topic occur to you intuitively, or did you make a rational decision to pursue intuition as a subject?
So that's a great question because it was both. What I think happens that I think lots of people get confused about is that we all have this lay view of what we think intuition and gut feel, what they are.
Hmm.
And, everything from some people think of intuition and gut feel as almost this mystical, magical quality. And then there are other people who think of gut feel as almost a heuristic or something biased that we need to gather more data to be able to understand so that we're not led astray. But in fact, what a lot of my study of gut feel, the science around gut feel that I've discovered is that it's actually data and personal experience. It's the two in combination. And when we start to understand what's happening during this intuiting process that we undergo, where we are drawing from all sorts of experiences and expertise and our culture and our backgrounds, as well as signals that we get or data points that we see, that's when it actually culminates in a gut feel. And so for me, it really was both. It was knowing all of the experiences that I had had. It was my engineering training. It was the frameworks, the methods, all of the things that I had experienced, as well as what was in front of me, what I was seeing, the prompts, the signals, and all of that coming together.
It's not that your book is arguing that we should always listen to our intuition or our intuition is always right, but we can learn to listen to it and to figure out whether it's the right direction or not.
Well, what I find is that gut feel is always right for
Mm.
certain types of problems or certain types of decisions. What I find is that there are four different types of problems out there, or four
Mhm.
different types of decisions that we might have, right? So there are simple problems, there are complicated problems, there are complex problems, and there are chaotic problems.
Okay, can you give me a quick example
For
of
sure, for
those? Yeah.
sure. So simple problems, right, are problems where there is a yes, no, right, wrong, probabilistic, correct, incorrect type of answer, right? So when we know that there is a probabilistic or a certainty around the answer, we shouldn't be using our gut feel, right? Because at best, our gut feel is going to be redundant.
Would this be like an arithmetic problem, or
Yeah,
what
like
would be an
what
example of
percent
a
of the
simple problem?
time is your coin going to flip heads, right? And
Don't
if we're
use your
using
intuition to answer that question.
right, and if we use our intuition to, at best, it'll be redundant, right?
Right.
But in most cases, or in some cases, it'll lead us astray. Okay. Then there are complicated problems. And this is where it starts to get a little bit trickier when gut feel comes to play, because complicated problems are actually just multiple simple problems stacked on top of each other, right? They are just multiple simple problems in continuum.
I think you give the example of a Rubik's Cube as a complicated problem that also isn't a place you should use your intuition. It's
Exactly.
it's
Exactly.
complicated, but it is actually a series of small, simple steps that you should really just follow those small, simple
That's
steps.
right. And so a lot of times, because complicated problems seem like they're so complicated, we take shortcuts. Because, these complicated problems, you can find the right solution, but it just takes time, or it takes training, or it takes finding the right resources, or the right people, or the right expertise, or all of those things. And so we get lazy. We take shortcuts and we use our gut feel. And again, we shouldn't be using our gut feel for these types of decisions, but we do anyways. And this is the whole area that, heuristics like anchoring bias and sunk cost bias and all of these
Right.
things, the whole Danny Kahneman thinking fast and slow, that whole tradition, that's where it fits into these complicated problems that we make these shortcuts, we use heuristic, and we fall prey to biases because we got lazy.
So just to make sure I'm understanding that, so because this is one of my questions, is how do we distinguish our intuition and the valuable part of it from bias? Maybe my intuition is leading me astray because I've got whatever cognitive or personal biases feeding into it. But you're saying in this case, that comes into play when I'm trying to use my intuition to give me a shortcut to solve a complicated problem, where really reason and data should probably be my primary guides. And my intuition is just going to add noise to that system.
That's right, because there is a solution to it. It might take longer, but there is actually a solution to it. You can, at some point, gather 100% of the information and 100% of the data to make it a correct answer, right? Probabilistically, there is a correct answer. So those are the two that sometimes when we use our gut feel, we get into trouble.
Right.
And we confound that with complex and chaotic decisions, right? Complex and chaotic decisions are, even if we tried to get all of the data and all of the information, we would maybe only end up with 80% at the max, right? But more likely, we're only ending up with 20% or 30% of the information that we need to make those decisions. And that is because so many of these decisions are not these binary decisions or these probabilistic decisions that are out there. The decisions around things like, is this person going to be the best person for me to hire? Well,
Mm-hmm.
that depends. It depends on your management style. It depends on their expertise. It depends on all the company, the context, the industry, right? Or should I buy this house or that house? Well, it
Mm-hmm.
depends. It depends on,
Should I
you
date
know,
this person or marry this person?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And in this way, right, it emphasizes a really important point, which is that everyone, for these complex and chaotic decisions, we may have different gut feels, right?
Yeah.
You might be making a decision about which house to buy. I might be making a decision about what house to buy. And our gut feel will tell us very different things, as it should. Because a lot of times people say, like, what is gut feel, like, what is, and what I say is I do have a definition, but the better question is not what is gut feel. The better question is who is gut feel, because gut feel is you.
Mm-hmm.
And the more you integrate your own unique experiences, pattern, schemas, mental models, all of those things into it, the more you're going to be able to hone and harness and train your gut feel so that you make better decisions that you can trust.
Maybe this is a good moment to pause for some definitions. Could you define what intuition is versus gut feel? I think a lot of us think these are synonymous, but you think there's an important difference there.
There is a very important difference, which is that intuition and gut feel are two very different things. Intuition is a process, right? What I call the intuiting process. And gut feel is the outcome of the process. So during the process, that is where we are integrating. That's where we're taking into account the data we might be receiving, the signals, the personal experience that we have, the patterns that we're noticing. And this intuiting process, what makes it confusing is that sometimes this process lasts a really long time, 20 years, 30 years.
Wow.
But sometimes it's really short, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. But there is a distinct process that ends in a gut feel outcome.
Okay.
And that gut feel outcome is a flash of clarity that results from that intuiting process, which is drawing from the interaction of all of those personal experiences and external data that I spoke about. What's important about that gut feel judgment, that outcome, is the fact that it's recognizable. We can train ourselves to both be better at the process as well as noticing how our own gut feel manifests.
By your definition, is intuition inherently an unconscious process, or can it be also a conscious one?
It can be both. It can be conscious or unconscious. And that piece that I mentioned around we can train our gut feel is how do we actually train ourselves to make it more conscious? How
I
do we
see.
train ourselves to notice it? It's not entirely subconscious. And what I mean by this is that during the intuiting process, there is a lot that's sort of happening and there's a lot that's sort of whispering to us. And that's where I often talk about we need to be better at listening to what whispers and not what screams.
Because what screams could be some emotion you're having, which might be part of it, but it might not be. It might just be sort of confusing to you because that's your immediate emotional response, but that's a little different from the gut feeling that you're having, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, this notion of listening to what whispers and not what screams, there is so much that is screaming at us, right? There are things that are literally loud ambulances, laundry machines, vacuum cleaners, you have it, right? But there are also lots of things that are loud and screaming at us that we don't even necessarily recognize, right? Even when we're asking someone for advice, for example, right? When we ask someone for advice, what's the first thing, when we have a big problem that we're trying to solve or something that we're grappling with, the first thing we do is we pick up the phone and we call someone that we trust and we say,
Mm.
okay, what would you do? Right. So we're not even giving ourselves the space to listen to what is individually, personally whispering to us. It's like we fill up a dinner party, right, with voices of all of these people that we trust, that we respect, but we often don't do the equivalent of reserving one of those seats for ourselves and our own perspectives. We don't let ourselves speak because there's so much loudness in the dinner party that's telling us what to do. And that's that listening to what whispers because our intuition whispers to us, but we can get better at understanding what forms that whisper comes to us. And what you're mentioning, emotions, one of those loud things that presents itself to us. And
Mhm.
we misconstrue our emotions or our feelings sometimes as our gut feel, right? We think gut feel is feelings. But in fact, one way that I think about this is, like emotions are like children. You don't want them driving your car because they'll crash it, right? But you also don't shove them in the trunk because they might die, right? And so you want them in the back seat where they
Right.
can be seen and heard and attended to, but they're not in control of anything,
Oh
right?
my
And
God, I
that's the
love
same
that.
thing with emotions in gut feel. I love this metaphor because we give our emotions the right seat.
That's great. And listeners should know that in your book, it's not just an academic book. There are a lot of exercises that you offer to people to both cultivate their intuition, the process of acquiring that sort of long-term data and attending to your gut feeling, like even just, body awareness, being attuned to your emotions, just understanding how you operate so that you can feel it, literally a feeling in your body that's giving you a signal that about what to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's an important point because the book was really around how do we hone our gut feel? How do we harness it? How do we train it? So, a very small portion of the book is around, the definition of it and
Right.
and all of these things. The main part of the book, the whole entire, second half and more is around what are the tools we need, the tips, the tricks, the tactics, all of the different ways that we can be honing it and harnessing it. And so, even for the piece around emotions, right, I offer ways that we can think about our emotions, like just even simply asking yourself, right, am I acting from clarity or from a feeling I haven't named yet? Right.
Hmm.
If I were completely calm, would I still make the same decision? Right. Because
Interesting. Yeah.
a lot of times when if the answer is yes, if I were completely calm, would I make the same decision? If the answer is yes, it's probably gut feel. But if the answer is no, it might be your emotions trying to take that front seat, right?
Right.
The same, if you feel urgency pushing you to make a decision, if you give it 24 hours, if we have that luxury, sometimes we don't, but you can also, even just see 5 minutes down the road, if I am I still feeling that same sense of urgency? Am I feeling kind of that skittish, nervous energy? Because that's sort of what's screaming at you versus the whispers. What's that signal that continues to come back to you, right? So the screams are always loud and quick. The
Right.
whispers are quiet and prolonged. And what we do is we tend to push the whispers away to a point where it doesn't come back. But if it continues coming back to you, let it come back to you before you get to that point where you push it entirely away.
I want to get into more detail about some of these techniques, but before we leave this topic entirely, I want to make sure I have a good handle on what kinds of issues, what kinds of decisions you're recommending tuning into your gut feeling on. You say that either simple or complicated problems are probably not the right place to use your intuition, but complex or what you call chaotic problems are ones where your intuition comes into play more. So just to go over some examples, how would say, because I think in your dissertation you focused on professional investors.
Yes.
So is choosing to invest in a stock, is that a complicated question or is it a chaotic question?
Yeah, there is
What's the
no
role of intuition in that?
Yeah, there is definitely a role of intuition in
Mm.
picking a stock, for example, because you don't know whether or not the stock is going to perform well or not perform well. You don't know whether it's going to go up or down. You do have historical data. You do have metrics. You can calculate things like a PE ratio. You can look at revenues. You can look at expenses. You can look at cash flows. That's all part of your intuition. You shouldn't ignore that. So I'm not saying that you say, oh, my gut feel is that I should invest in this stock because I like its stock ticker. No.
Right.
But you do use your intuition to do things like looking at its comparables or looking at or taking your own experience and thinking, wow, you know what, this is a company that I continue to shop at. Like, I love the products and I feel like more people are going to want these products, and
Mhm.
every time I mention this product to somebody, they tell two other people, right? So not only do you have the data, right, they have a virality coefficient of 2.3. You also have the experience of every time I talk to somebody about this company, they seem to recommend it to two to three other people, right? And so you have all of that that sort of comes together.
Yeah, I think you give the example of Uber as a stock that probably most data would have told you not to invest in, but there were a number of early investors who had an intuitive sense that the taxi industry was broken, and they went with that and probably made a better investment.
Absolutely, right? There was all sorts of factors that were at play there, right? They're around like, wow, the taxi cab industry is already doing very well. Seems like there's a lot of regulatory risk. What about tolls and fees? What about safety issues? People are going to be riding in strangers' cars. Where's the accountability? There was all of these factors that were saying, no, this company is never going to do well. But people use their intuition and they said, yes, but there's also this appetite for a different experience, a different type of way that we do transportation. There was a gut feel around the fact that there wasn't a lot of technology that was embedded in taxis, and ride sharing was not even a thing yet, right? And so there was a lot of people who understood that you could add technology to improve both the mapping, the ordering, the demand, looking at both supply and demand sides of the business. And so they used their experience and their sort of wisdom and their patterns and things that they had known, and took a chance on this company that ended up being really huge for them.
And it would strike me that the kinds of problems where your intuition would be dominant would be the most personal questions. How should I raise my child? Where should I send my child to school? Who should I choose as a life partner? These are things where there's only going to be so much data available to you, but there might be a lot of intuition. There might be a lot of life experience, your priors, as you call them, that you're bringing to that question. And maybe in those cases, your job is to really get as good a handle as you can on who you are. Like what is it what is your life experience bringing to bear on this question? And that's what you should be listening to, not trying to gather like a lot of data on schools or neighborhoods or your partner's background or anything like that. You should get that information, I guess, but really you're going to rely much more on your personal instincts. Is that right?
Yeah, and this is where it gets tricky sometimes because we're all so interconnected with each other. So we start to question our own truth, and then we push it away, right? And so we push away our own authenticity in some ways because we are people pleasers by nature. We have the same models for what are the best schools to go to, what are the best occupations to have, what does success mean? right? And so, as part of this, when I was studying gut feel, I interviewed people with all different definitions of success, right? Everyone from the traditional definitions of success, those people who are CEOs of companies, Olympic gold medalists, entrepreneurs who had taken their companies public, and also sort of the non-traditional definitions of success, right? So, formerly incarcerated individuals who were able to get back on their feet, women who had left the workplace for decades and were able to get back on their feet, and everything in between, to really understand this notion that you're raising here, which is that we sometimes ignore the intuition because we don't quite understand what the main thing is for ourselves, right?
Right.
The sort of keep the main thing. But it's so easy to kind of forget that because we get pulled into other people's conceptions of what they're doing and what success means. And so even a decision like choosing the right spouse, right? Well, choosing the right spouse comes with it all sorts of like, oh, but what will other people think of this person? Do my friends like this person? Will my parents like this person? Do they have tremendous earning power? Do they
Mm,
have, all sorts of different things that come into play that come in from other people? And
right.
that's not to say that that doesn't matter, but it is just to say that those are seats at the dinner table. And we also need to keep one seat at the dinner table for ourselves and our own voice.
I do find this topic very interesting. I was a few years ago making a decision about making a move from one city to another, and it was so complicated. There seemed to be so many issues involved. And I got really interested in decision making theory, and I was drawing out these different matrices and kind of doing pros and cons and all these lists. And
Yeah.
I was really hoping that just through data, I would kind of land upon the right answer. And I think I never really did this piece of it, which was really trying to listen to what I already knew, listen to the gut. Why do you think it's so hard for us to do that? I know the world is a noisy place. There are ambulance sounds and there are all these distractions. Do you think that we've gotten worse at it? It's gotten harder for us to listen to our instincts?
Yeah, I think it has because we tend to reward what screams. We've really evolved to prioritize and put a premium on things that are faster, louder, quicker, more out there, right? All of those sort of things we don't really reward. The same thing sort of happens with the books we read, the things we're watching, right? When you follow the recommendations of everyone else, we all start becoming more like everybody else, right? If you
Right.
read the same things as everyone else and you watch the same things as everyone else, you start to become like everyone else. I think that's one piece of it. The second piece of it is that we live in a very linear world in the sense that,
Mm,
like, we like to think very linearly, right? We read books linearly, page 2 to 3 to 4. We try and understand things linear, but I don't think that that's actually, when you scratch under the surface, right? Especially with gut feel, it's not linear at all. We might come to a gut feel because of one piece of information that we learned yesterday, one piece of information, something we experienced when we were 5 years old,
right.
something that we learned when we were in high school that a teacher might have said, a quote that we read last month. And all of that comes together and allows us to sort of see something that we haven't seen before. And it becomes really hard to understand that. We don't necessarily want to put in the work to to sort of understand things that are not linear. We love, like, give us the 5 tips
Yeah.
to, losing weight, or what are the 5 steps it takes to becoming a much better spouse, or, we love those kind of airtight, small, like cute little things that
Yeah.
give us that quick solution.
Yeah.
And I think the more we prioritize that way of thinking and learning, and the more we reward those screams, the easier it is for us to get away from our gut feel and what whispers to our own detriment.
You started to say before that there are different categories, there are different kinds of gut feel. Could you tell me what your three types are?
Yeah. So, what I mentioned is that we all have very different ways that we experience our gut feel, right? So, it might feel like something in the pit of your stomach, right? Or you might feel a sense of anxiety, right? For me, I might feel something that's like, oh, a burst of excitement. And then my hands start to like shake. So, we have different ways that we experience it physically emotionally, and so on and so forth. So it's very individual. But there are sort of three different categories of ways that gut feel kind of manifests, right? And those three ways are eureka moments, spidey senses, and jolts. So a eureka moment is really those aha moments that we hear about. So there's something that we're puzzling over, or something that we're trying to solve for ourselves, or something that we're not sure about. And then we have that aha moment, like, aha, yes, that's what I should name my company, right? I've been trying to figure out the name of a company for months, and like, aha, I see it. Like, that's, I saw this word, and that's that aha moment. It's perfect. The spidey sense isn't the aha moment. It's the uh-oh, like, uh-oh, right? You know, you're
Something's
walking
wrong.
through the dark alley and like, I should not be here, right? It's that
Right.
uh-oh moment.
Something feels off and you can't
Something
quite
feels
say
off.
what. Yeah.
Exactly. And then the jolt is not an aha, but it's more of a oh, right? It's not like an uh-oh, but it's more of an oh. And so what I mean by that is a jolt is like taking you to something that you like, it's changing the way you fundamentally
Yeah.
saw something, right?
Yeah.
You always thought it was like this, and now you're realizing, oh, like, no, it's actually a different, it's something else,
Right.
right?
It's sort
And
of a surprise. And maybe it's what it's telling you is that your intuition, your previous experiences that you're bringing to this actually aren't right. They're not lining up with this situation.
yeah, absolutely. Like, I always like it, and it can be, and sometimes we sort of misconstrue some of these things, but like, I'll give you an example of a jolt moment, right? A
Yeah.
jolt moment is like, oh, I always thought I wanted to be this. Like, I always thought I wanted to be a chef.
Mm.
But now, I realize that like it wasn't about being a chef, right? And so I tell this story about this really interesting chef named Dan Gusti, who was the chef of a 3 Michelin star restaurant called Noma, which is based in Copenhagen. And Noma was voted best restaurant in the world like numerous times. And Dan Gusti was the head chef of this 3 star Michelin starred restaurant. So he had reached the crux, right? The epitome of talented chef. Thought he was happy, right? Thought he was doing his thing, was really like felt rewarded, all these sort of things. And then one day he was flipping through this magazine and he saw this article, and it just had 3 words. Like, his eyes skimmed over this article, and it said food for all. It was an article about food justice, right? But he didn't even really kind of consciously, it was just the food for all part. And the food for all part combined, that was like the prompt,
Mm-hmm.
combined with, all of a sudden he started thinking about his grandmother, who he used to like can tomatoes with, his Italian grandmother that he would make tomato sauce with, and they would can tomatoes when he was young. And his grandmother would always talk about, we don't have a lot of money, but our kitchen is always open to everyone, right?
Mm.
Anybody that is hungry, anyone that wants to stay for dinner, anyone, they can always stay. And they were always canning tomatoes and making sauce and all of these things. And he could remember the tastes and the smells and all of that. And it was the reason why he became a chef.
Mm-hmm.
All of this kind of collided, and he had this jolt moment. And 3 months later, he left his job as the top chef of this #1 in the world restaurant and started an organization called Brigade, which cooks for all. They do food for children in cafeterias, incarcerated individuals, people in nursing homes, just creating great tasting healthy food for everyone. And that's what he decided to do, and that was really what gave him, that's his purpose. And
Interesting.
it was from this jolt moment.
So let's talk about some of the ways you identify in the book that we can tune in better, that we can listen better to our gut feel. One that you mentioned is maybe the most familiar to many of us is the coin flip method, where you use flipping a coin not to make the decision, but to figure out how you feel about the decision. Can you explain
That's
how that
right.
works?
Absolutely. So, in the sort of, again, with the theme of like, we can train ourselves, right? It doesn't have to be subconscious. We can make the subconscious conscious. we can make the unquantifiable quantifiable. One of the ways that I started studying, well, how do we even know? Like, how can we start to hone in on the fact that there is a whisper, right? That there is an intuition trying to tell us something. Because we do what you were saying that a lot of us do. We make pro con lists, right? We
Mhm.
look at the pluses and the minuses. We do all of those sort of things. And so I had a student who was telling me this story, and he was in his country's special forces military, right? And what his job was that he had to choose who the next cohort of special forces cadets, like the cadets who was going to be named into the special forces. And so he would train hundreds of cadets. And during this training, he would be looking at mental aptitude, physical aptitude, emotional resilience, all sorts of different things. And out of all of these hundreds, he would have to pick five that would go on to this very elite division of the military.
Mhm.
And he always said, it became pretty clear, right, for the most part, who the top one, two, three were, right? So those were easy to kind of decide. But number four and number five was always trickier, right?
Mhm.
Because there were some, when you look at the pro con list, right? Some were like mentally and super intelligent and all of these, but then they were a little bit weaker in something else, right? And then
Mhm.
there might be someone who's like really, really resilient and hardworking, but they were a little bit lower on this. And so, how do you gauge, how do you pick
Mhm.
between that one, person A and person B when there's this sort of pro con type of
Right. So
thing,
those were
right?
complex or chaotic decisions as opposed to number one and number two might have been complicated, but basically knowable. These other ones,
Exactly,
yeah.
Michael. I love it. I wish you were in my classroom and you could, tie these different things together. Absolutely, right? So with these sort of decisions, there's really not a definitive probabilistic right answer because there's just so many factors. And at most, you're probably getting 40-50% of the data that you
Mhm.
that you sort of need. And so he agonized over this decision for a really long time. And he's like, yeah, like I think it's person B because look, like he's worked so hard and he really wants it. And he's shown us time and time again how hard he's willing to work for this. Right. And so he's like, yeah, it's person B. But for whatever reason, like I still struggle. Like I'm struggling whether it should be that person. And so his commanding officer basically was like, flip a coin. Heads, it is him. Tails, it's not him. And he was like, "What? Flip a coin for a decision like this? Like this is like I'm determining someone we're gonna put out there. He's gonna be in charge of people's lives. It's gonna be life or death situation. We have to know that he's gonna be equipped for this. How do I just flip a coin?" And he's like, "Just flip a coin." So he flips a coin, and it says head, right? So yeah, this guy should make it into the special forces. And he's like, so his commanding officer is like, "Okay, it's heads. He's in." And then my student and then his commanding officer asked him, he's like, "Okay, so how do you feel?" And he's like, "Oh gosh, I wish it had been tails." And he goes, "There's your answer." Right? In that moment, that split second moment after you flip heads or tails, are you glad it was tails? And you're like, yes, validation that he is the right person. Or is it you wish it was tails? And if you're like, "Oh, I wish it was tails," there's your answer. You're actually starting to help yourself listen to those whispers and push out all of the information that you were telling yourself. Things like, "Oh, but he's worked so much harder than everybody else. And he was this and that and all these things." Because when it comes to it, that split second was like, do I trust him in battle to be in charge of my life and the lives of others? And you can't always place numbers to that. You can't always explain what it is or what it isn't because there are regulations, there are rules, there are all sorts of metrics and things that you are looking at and sometimes that gets hidden.
What are some other techniques besides the coin flip that can help us tune into our gut feel?
Let me talk about one that I think sometimes is a little bit overlooked because we don't like to talk about failure as much, right? But our failures also contribute to our intuition and our gut feel. But what happens a lot of times is that the more we become an expert at something, the more we start to misunderstand our failures and fall prey to something that's called situational arrogance,
Mm.
meaning that we become arrogant to the fact that we could be making mistakes because our patterns And our prototypes have been so strong that we're then later on not as good at noticing when something is off or a miss. And then we start to make the wrong gut feel because we wrong decision or
Mm.
use criteria that might not be well situated, right? So a quick example of this is a man named Ron Johnson, who was the CEO of J.C. Penney. And he was once dubbed the biggest business failure of the 21st century, right? No one wants to be called the biggest business failure of the 21st century. And within 18 months of stepping in as CEO of J.C. Penney, we all know now J.C. Penney is bankrupt. He got fired and faced tremendous failure. But the issue wasn't that he was a tremendous failure. The issue was that he was actually a tremendous success before he stepped into J.C. Penney, right? He started out his career at Target, and at Target, he was single handedly responsible for turning Target into Target, right? Like the design, the layout, bringing in the brands and, Rachel Ray cookware and Massimo Dutti clothing and the look and feel of it and really bringing Target to all sorts of tremendous success. After Target, he went to Apple, and at Apple, he was again responsible for the look and feel of the Apple stores, right? The minimalist, the design, the colors, the lack of colors, the sort of windows. He was the creator of the Genius Bar, right? At the back of the Apple stores that we all know, right? All of these sort of things. He was super, super successful in retail. And then he went to J.C. Penney and he used the same sort of patterns. He used the same expertise and fell prey to situational arrogance. What he didn't realize was that there was one critical variable that was different. At both Target and an Apple, he was facing what was called, an opportunity gap, right? This opportunity, he could take it from where it was and elevate it to something else. Whereas at J.C. Penney, they were bleeding cash. Fashion was changing, things were moving to e-commerce, and he didn't realize that he faced a performance gap where he had to stop the bleeding. So all the things he did around the design, and he even had a jeans bar instead of the Genius Bar, right? For J.C. Penney and buying blue jeans. He used all the same expertise that he had learned, and he fell prey to situational arrogance. And so I talk about how can we make sure that we don't fall prey to the same type of situational arrogance. And one way that you can do this, right, is by being an expert and really understanding your expertise, but also being able to take the novice perspective while you're in the midst of that expertise, right? So, a simple example of this is, let's say that you're right handed, right? Are you right handed? Okay. So I assume you brush your teeth with your right hand, right? And you're really good at brushing your teeth with your right hand. You're an expert. But let's say that tonight you start brushing your teeth just for one night with your left hand. You're now sort of putting yourself in the position of a novice. You're noticing things that you didn't notice before. You might be like, oh, wow, like this part of my gums actually hurts and I never noticed that. Or like, oh, this tooth, like, oh, I usually miss this part of my mouth. I don't brush as much. I kind of neglect this part of my mouth. You start to notice things and pick up on different signals and cues and information as a novice, even though you're still an expert.
Yeah, and I think you also recommend having a diversity of conversations, like not just always having the same kinds of conversations with your same group of friends, but doing things, putting yourself deliberately, regularly into slightly uncomfortable situations where you're not an expert. This is a great way for us to learn, to hone our intuition, to avoid situational arrogance. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And the key is to be able to not just talk to, anybody, but to do it in a way where you still maintain your expertise, right? You do it in a way where you still know all of the things that you know, but you're able to introduce the other pieces of it, right? So I'll give you like a business example of this, right? So there's a company called Zipcar, right? And in the very, very early days of Zipcar, so you might know Zipcar, but basically the whole business around it is that you live in a big city, right? New York City or Chicago, and you don't need a car every day, right? But every once in a while, you need a car to go on a big Costco run, right? Or to pick up your mother from the airport or something. And so you just need a car for like a couple of hours. And then you give it back. And so you don't need to spend the money of buying a car and keeping it all the time. You just need a car every once in a while. So that's the whole business model of Zipcar. In the very early days of Zipcar, people were looking at Zipcar and its numbers, and investors were trying to decide whether to invest. And it looked like a tremendous idea, right? Lots of experts who came from transportation, lots of experts who came from the rental car industry, all sorts of people that were like, this is an amazing idea. We know things about the quality and the maintenance of cars and having multiple drivers and all sorts of different schemas that they had from the rental car. They're all experts, right? And but there was this one person who was like, oh, like I have this weird feeling. Like I want to try and figure out, why do I feel like this company is not going to be successful? And so what he started to do was like, instead of being an executive in a rental car company, he was like, I'm going to rent this car. I'm going to rent a car. And because he didn't have to rent a car, he had his own drivers and all these sort of things. I'm just going to rent a car and drive it around for, 3 or 4 days. And so he's kind of putting himself in the position of a novice in the rental car industry by acting like a consumer rather than an investor. Okay. And what he realized about Zipcar was that there was one quantitative metric in their business plan that didn't make sense, which rendered their entire business plan irrelevant. And that was something called the utilization rate. The utilization rate in the original business plan said 80%. And that was an assumption that other things were premised on, like their growth rate, the number of cars that they needed to buy, the number of cities that they were going to be in. And he's like, 80% doesn't make sense.
Wait, can you tell me what a utilization rate
Yeah,
means? Okay.
exactly. This was the point that he was like, so utilization, he realized, was like, well, how many hours are there in a day? There's 24 hours in a day. So 80% utilization means that 80% of the 24 hours, the cars are going to be rented. So that means that even during the hours of 2 a.m. to 5 a.m., there are some people who are renting this car. Or if there's nobody, that means that the cars are being rented 100% of the time between the hours of 5 a.m. all the way to the next 2 a.m. That number didn't make sense, but it made sense to all the rental car executives because 80% utilization was what they got from the rental car industry. And that makes sense because in the rental car industry, you're paying per day. So even if you're not driving between the hours of 2 a.m. to 5 a.m., you're still paying for those hours, right? You're still paying for the hours between 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. Whereas with Zipcar, when you're renting on an hourly basis, if no one's driving your cars between 2 a.m. to 5 a.m., there's no way you're going to get an 80% utilization rate. And so when he realized this, he told Zipcar, look, you need to either redo your story around what's happening, or you need to fix your numbers. Because right now, there's no congruence between the story you're telling about what Zipcar is going to do and the growth and the expansion and the number of cars and all of these things, all because of that one number, that one metric. And it's all because somebody was able to practice, right? Actually thinking like a novice when
Right.
they were actually an expert.
That's a really interesting example. Yeah, it actually makes me think that sort of like the way you suggested putting your emotions in the back seat of the car, not in the front seat, not in the trunk. Your intuition similarly is something that has its place but needs to be trained and disciplined. You talk about
Yeah.
intentional intuition, I think you say.
Yeah.
So you can't just say, I feel this way, so therefore it's right, because that's going to get you into this situational arrogance problem where you're just overvaluing your past successes and ignoring your past mistakes. You need to practice. You need to spend some time with your mistakes. You need to spend some time as a novice. You need to kind of take some actions in your life that will make your intuition better and stronger over time.
And the more intentional you get at it during the training piece of it, the more later on you can make decisions that are still intentional, but they don't feel like they necessarily are because you have already gone through this practice of trusting and knowing what's sort of happening behind the scenes.
You give us a lot of techniques in the book for honing and tapping into this gut feel, and there are different dimensions of it: personified, embodied, emotional,
Mhm.
cognitive. In some ways, I think what you're really recommending is self-awareness, just becoming more in touch and in tune with yourself, how you operate, so that therefore you can learn how to use these instincts better. So sometimes it's really listening to your body and understanding where in your body this intuition, where this gut feel is occurring. Sometimes it's just learning more about your own cognitive biases so that you are correcting for them. And you have different techniques and methods. And is there one in particular that you want to call out about, like, how to really tap into your to the good part of your intuition while not overvaluing it or not, drawing the
Yeah,
wrong
I mean,
conclusions?
there's a couple. I'll just give you a couple quick ones. I mean, in
Hmm.
addition to like practice being a beginner again, right? The one
Hmm.
we talked about, right? Keeping a decision log, right? So if when you make those really big decisions, just write down what happened, what did I decide, and then revisit 3 months later, right? Did it end up being a good decision? Did it end up being not a good decision? Why not? Like you can start to identify patterns and calibrate your sort of instincts. The other is like trace it back, right? When you're making a gut feel, pause and ask yourself, where is this coming from? Right? Sort of reverse engineering strengthens that intuitive awareness. And the last one I would probably say is like, creating stillness, right? So that you get better at hearing your own signal. So even just scheduling time for silence and observing your thoughts and sensations and subtle insights, right? I talk about in the book. How do you recognize the physical cues that your body is showing you? How do you recognize the emotional? How do you recognize the cognitive? Well, actually scheduling time so that you do that, because otherwise what happens is we get caught up in the hustle and bustle of all of the things that are happening to us. We get caught up in like the next bonus, or the shares that are vesting, or the team that's depending on us, and all of these things, and it becomes very, very hard to leave that space for that stillness.
Mm. One of the surprising tips you offer is reading more novels, right?
Yeah.
Why does fiction help us with our intuition?
So I think fiction in particular. I know that I write nonfiction, and so much of my world is nonfiction. It's the science behind things and all of that. But the fiction is really where we start to see like that stream of consciousness. We start to see like where nodes and synapses and things start to connect together. Where, I always say that life rhymes. Life doesn't repeat itself, but life rhymes, where we might encounter one situation that reminds us a lot of some other situation that they were very, very different, but there was the same emotion that we felt. Or there might be one thing that happens and something else that happens, and we feel the same physical signal, but they were yet such different kind of emotional experiences. And with fiction, we start to notice things about ourselves and where those connections and those interconnections happen, right? And so, we might both be reading the same exact novel. And even though we take the same overall lesson from the novel, you're going to remember one scene that you think was much more poignant. And I'm going to remember something else, right? Might remember, remember like the main character said this to her daughter, and it was like, wow. And you might be like, I don't remember that at all, but I remember, this one part of the book where they're at this restaurant and they did this, or they were at the school and they did this. We remember lots of different things, and that allows us to just broaden the way that again, it's like broadening our own mental models and schemas and prototypes in a way that comes back to us in spades. And it doesn't come back to us linearly, but it comes back to us at these moments when we really need to trust our gut feel, where we really need to understand, like, okay, here's why I'm doing this, and here's why I'm better off for doing it this way.
Okay, listeners, read more fiction. That's one of the paths to honing your intuition. Okay, well, just to wrap up, are there any last thoughts or key takeaways that you feel more than anything you want your readers to take away from this book?
It goes back to the title of my book, like, you already know,
Mm.
right? Gut feel is you. You already know. And so what I would love is just for us to get back to a place where we trust ourselves, that we really, even when we know that there are algorithms and AI and machine learning and data and all of these quantitative things, that who we are and who you are and you already know. In the midst of all of that, that's also a tremendously important factor that really gives color to everything else.
Well, Laura, thank you very much for coming on the show. Really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks so much.